The first notice arrived like junk mail, the kind you throw away without reading. A plain white envelope, windowed address, a barcode, the sort of thing that usually contains a pharmacy receipt or a cable company apology. It sat on my kitchen counter among coupons and a flyer for a new car dealership, blending into the harmless clutter of ordinary life. I opened it because my name was printed too neatly, like the sender cared. Past due. Final notice. Lion sale warning. The words landed with a hard, immediate weight. My eyes tracked down the page looking for what account it belonged to, what service I had forgotten, what autopay had failed. Then I saw the business name. Northgate Self-Storage explained that my unit was delinquent and scheduled for auction. My unit. Except I didn't have a storage unit. I am Daniel Kerr, 59 years old, widowed, retired from a manufacturing plant, where I spent 3 decades repairing machines that never cared whether I was tired. I live outside Columbus, Ohio, in a ranch house with a 1-car garage and a small basement. I am not a man with hidden properties or secret rental units or a second life. My life is as plain as my mailbox. I read the notice again and again, expecting the meaning to change. It did not. It listed a unit number, an address near the industrial edge of town, and an amount due. It warned that the unit would be cut and cleared if payment wasn't received within 10 days. It included a link to pay online. My hands stayed calm while my mind filled with possibilities. A mistake, a clerical error, someone with the same name, a scam. But the letter looked too real. The paper was thick. The language was precise. It referenced Ohio lien sale statutes and listed dates and procedures. That is how real trouble sounds. Official, patient, and indifferent. I didn't pay. I didn't click anything. I didn't call the number on the letter like a frightened man begging for reassurance. I sat down, took a sip of coffee that had already gone cold, and did what my old job taught me to do when something didn't make sense. I verified. Northgate Self-Storage had a real website. It had real reviews. It had a real address that matched the letter. The phone number on the website matched the number on the notice. The unit number on the notice looked like an internal system, not something a scammer would invent. My stomach tightened. The next question was simpler and worse. Who would open a unit in my name? Only one person had enough of my information to do it without hesitation. My son, Evan. Evan is 33. He is charismatic in the way that makes other people forgive him quickly. He is also careless in the way that makes consequences arrive late and heavy. Over the years, I had learned to catch him before he fell, covering rent, helping with car insurance, paying a phone bill just once, making a transfer until he got back on his feet. After my wife Laura died 7 years ago, my generosity hardened into a habit. Grief makes you eager to fix things because you couldn't fix the one thing that mattered. I couldn't keep Laura alive. I could keep Evan afloat. It felt like love. It felt like purpose. It also made me predictable. In the first year after Laura's funeral, I gave Evan a key to my house without thinking. He had been the one who helped me carry casseroles in from neighbors. He had driven relatives to the cemetery. He had sat with me on the couch when the evenings felt too wide and too quiet. A father notices those gestures and wants to reward them, wants to believe they mean something about character. When I returned to work after bereavement leave, Evan checked on the house for me. When I volunteered at a skills nonprofit on Saturdays, Evan made sure the basement didn't flood. When I took my mother to her appointments, Evan stopped by to see if I needed groceries. At the time, I told myself I was lucky, a son who showed up. Now, with the notice in my hand, those memories rearranged themselves into a different picture. A son who had access. I kept my voice steady when I called Northgate. I told them I received a delinquency notice for a unit I did not recognize, and asked them to confirm the account details. The employee on the phone was polite and trained for annoyed customers. She asked for my name and the unit number. Then she said something that made my throat tighten. The account was under my name, my mailing address, and my driver's license number. The license number. I felt a cold clarity move through me. A stranger might guess a name. A stranger might steal an address. A stranger could not casually attach my license number unless they had access to my documents. Evan had access. When the employee asked if I wanted to pay the balance now to stop the lien process, I told her I needed to verify identity. I asked whether the account listed an email or phone number. It did. An email I didn't recognize. A phone number I did recognize. Evans. The employee didn't say his name. She didn't need to. I knew his number better than I wanted to. I had typed it so many times into transfer forms and emergency payment pages that it might as well have been etched into my fingers. I hung up and sat in silence with the notice in my hand, like it was a piece of evidence from a crime scene. I thought about how it would feel to be furious. Fury would have been easier. Fury burns hot and then fades. What I felt instead was a slow, sinking grief, the kind that has no dramatic shape, the kind that makes you understand you have been living with a lie. I didn't call Evan. Not yet. I drove to Northgate. The facility sat behind a chain-link fence topped with loops of wire, not to keep criminals out, but to keep everyone's secrets in. The entrance gate opened with a keypad and cameras that tracked my car like eyes that never blinked. The office building was a small brick rectangle with bright LED lights and posters promising security and peace of mind. Peace of mind is what people buy when they don't trust their own lives. Inside the office, the air smelled like cheap air freshener and cardboard. A woman at the counter greeted me with the weary friendliness of someone who has heard every story a customer uses to explain late payments. I told her I believed a unit had been rented under my identity. Her expression changed. The friendliness tightened into procedure. She asked for ID. I handed her my driver's license. She compared it to the account on her screen. She nodded once, like the computer had confirmed what we both already knew. She told me the unit was rented 3 months earlier. She told me the lock was on it, a standard disc lock. She told me the delinquency had been recurring, paid 1 month, late the next. A pattern of someone managing just enough to keep it from being discovered, until they couldn't. I asked whether I could see the paperwork. She printed it. The contract had my name in the printed sections. It had my address. It had my license number. It had a signature at the bottom that looked like a child's imitation of adult handwriting. Not my signature. Not even close. The sadness sharpened into something colder. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a choice. I asked to access the unit. Policy required a manager and documentation. They needed to cut the lock in the presence of staff if I claimed fraud. They needed to document the contents for the lien process and potential law enforcement involvement. There were rules. There were forms. There was an entire system built around the fact that people lie, and storage units collect those lies until the rent stops. A manager escorted me through rows of metal doors. The corridor smelled like dust and hot concrete. The lights hummed. The air was thick with the quiet of other people's abandoned decisions. When we reached my unit, I felt my stomach tighten again. The disc lock was new. The kind of lock Evan liked. Shiny, thick, expensive enough to imply seriousness. The manager photographed it, then used bolt cutters with practiced force. The lock fell to the ground with a dull metallic sound that echoed down the hallway. He rolled up the door. The first thing I saw was a wooden rocking horse. It was painted blue, chipped at the edges, with one ear missing. It had been in my wife's classroom. Laura taught second grade for years, the kind of teacher who kept old toys because children loved them even when the paint wore off. That horse was not valuable in a monetary sense. It was valuable because Laura's hands had touched it, because her laughter had filled the room where it lived. It should have been in my basement with the other things I couldn't bear to throw away. Instead, it was in a storage unit rented under my name like contraband. I stepped inside and felt the air change. Storage units have a stale smell that carries the ghost of whatever people store. Paper, fabric, old wood, dried adhesive, the faint sourness of things sealed too long. Cardboard boxes were stacked along one wall. Plastic bins were piled in a corner. A filing cabinet sat in the back, the kind you find in old offices. A couple of duffel bags lay on the floor. A rolled-up rug leaned against the side, and in the center, under a tarp, was something that made my chest tighten. A cedar chest. Laura's cedar chest. I recognized it instantly. She bought it secondhand the year Evan was born. She polished it every spring. She stored baby blankets and letters and small souvenirs from trips we took when we were young and broke. When she got sick, she asked me to keep the chest safe. Safe. I pulled the tarp back and ran my hand along the cedar lid like I was checking a machine for damage. My fingers found scratches, shallow ones, like someone had dragged the chest across concrete. I opened it. The smell hit me first, cedar and old paper. Inside were neatly folded quilts, Laura's handwriting on tags attached to them. Under the quilts were envelopes tied with ribbon. Under those were photo albums. I sat on my heels and held one of the albums like it was fragile glass. How did my son get this? The answer arrived quickly, because the answer always arrives once you stop lying to yourself. He had a key. He had access. He had been in my house while I was at the grocery store or at a doctor appointment or at one of the volunteer workshops I taught. He had wandered my basement. He had looked through boxes. He had taken what he wanted and then placed my memories in a rented unit like they were items in a backlog. In the back corner, I found a plastic tote filled with framed photos. The glass on several frames was cracked. One frame held the last family picture we took before Laura's diagnosis. A summer picnic. Evan standing behind us with his arms around our shoulders, his face younger and less sharp. The crack across the photo felt like an accident until I noticed the frame was wrapped with tape in the way people wrap things when they plan to move them, not protect them. I saw my own life packed like cargo. Then I saw it. A manila envelope taped to the side of the filing cabinet. The envelope was thick and stuffed with papers. The tape was old enough to yellow at the edges, like it had been stuck there intentionally, to be found later. I peeled it off carefully and opened it. Pawn tickets, receipts, rows of them folded and creased. Each one had an item description, a date, and an amount. My throat tightened as I read. Gold bracelet, $40, diamond earrings, $120, silver watch with inscription, $60, guitar amplifier, $85, men's tool set, $90. It kept going. It wasn't one pawn ticket. It was a history. My hands shook slightly as I flipped through the receipts. Some were for pawn shops, some were for online resale platforms. Some were handwritten notes that looked like inventory. What sold, for how much, and where. Then I found a page that made me feel physically sick. A printed screenshot of an online listing. The listing showed Laura's quilt, the one with sunflowers stitched into the corners. The photo was taken on a bare floor with poor lighting. The description described it as vintage, handmade, perfect for farmhouse decor. The seller name was a username I didn't recognize, but the email contact attached to the listing was the same one on the storage contract. What broke me wasn't the listing. It was the small comment thread printed beneath it. Strangers asking questions. A reply that sounded like someone performing charm. And then, below the public thread, a private note that had been printed as if it were funny. A message Evan had sent to someone about how easy it was to sell old people nostalgia when the old person didn't even know it was gone. I didn't have to imagine Evan laughing. His laughter was right there on the paper, captured in the casual cruelty of someone who thinks a parent's grief is a resource. I looked up and saw another bin in the corner labeled, in black marker, Mom. The label wasn't sentimental, it was organizational. My stomach turned. I lifted the lid. Inside were velvet jewelry boxes. Most were empty. A few held cheap replacement pieces, the kind you buy at a mall kiosk to mimic something nicer. A chain that looked like gold but felt too light. A ring that wasn't Laura's. A bracelet with a broken clasp. The box I was looking for wasn't there. Laura's wedding ring. Laura's ring had disappeared months earlier. I had blamed myself. I had assumed I misplaced it in the fog of grief. The ring had sat in a small wooden box in my bedroom. One day it wasn't there. I had torn the house apart. I had blamed my own aging mind. I had accepted the loss as another small cruelty of life. Now I knew the truth. The ring wasn't lost. It was taken. And it was not the only thing taken. In a second tote, I found my father's watch, the one with a scratched face and an inscription on the back. I found it wrapped in an old sock like something being prepped for a pawn counter. My father died when I was 26. That watch had been the only piece of him I carried into adulthood. It should have been in my bedside drawer, not in a storage unit's corner. That was the moment the sadness changed shape. I had been willing to blame myself for losing things. Evan had been counting on that. I sat on the concrete floor of the storage unit with pawn receipts in my lap and felt something hollow open inside my chest. It wasn't just that Evan stole objects. It was that he stole my memories, my wife's presence, the proof of our life, and treated it like inventory. A person can forgive a son for borrowing money too often. It is harder to forgive a son for pawning a marriage. I forced myself to stand. I photographed everything. The contents, the receipts, the labels, the empty boxes. I scanned the unit slowly for anything else that mattered. Behind the filing cabinet, I found a thin binder. The cover was plain. Inside were printed screenshots of bank transfers. My bank transfers. Some were labeled with dates and notes like rent, car, and phone. Some were circled with a marker and annotated with numbers that looked like totals. This was not a son hiding a mistake. This was a son managing a system. The system included my money, my possessions, and my ignorance. There was also a folded sheet of paper in that binder, the kind of paper you get when you print from a phone note app. It listed what Evan called pressure points. It wasn't written like a confession. It was written like a plan. Items like guilt, loneliness, fear of being forgotten, the grandchildren, the anniversary month, my mother's health. It read like a map of my weak spots, the places you press when you want the vault door to open. I folded the paper back and placed it in the binder. I photographed it. I didn't need to read it twice. I drove back to the office and asked the manager for copies of the contract and the payment history. I asked for any camera footage of the unit being accessed. They couldn't give it to me immediately without procedure, but they told me it existed. They told me it would require a police request. I told them I would file one. When I left Northgate, I didn't go home. I went to the police station. At the front desk, I described the situation without drama, because drama makes people dismiss you. I explained that a storage unit had been rented under my identity. I provided the contract with my forged signature. I provided the employee's confirmation that Evan's number was attached to the account. I provided photographs of pawn receipts and my wife's property. The officer took it seriously, partly because identity fraud is clean and provable. There are statutes. There are definitions. There is paperwork that fits into boxes. Grief doesn't fit into boxes, but fraud does. I received a case number. Then I did what I should have done years earlier. I locked down my life. I froze my credit at all 3 bureaus. I placed a fraud alert. I changed every banking password and enabled two-factor authentication. I ordered new cards. I removed any authorized users on accounts. I lowered transfer limits. I set alerts for any transaction over a small threshold, the kind that would beep my phone if Evan tried to test my boundaries with just a little. The next day, one of those alerts did beep. A credit inquiry. Not approved, because my credit was frozen, but attempted. The notice didn't say Evan's name. It didn't have to. It told me someone had tried to open a line of credit using my identity at a regional bank. That attempt happened within 24 hours of the storage unit being opened. Evan had a habit of stacking risk. He didn't stop at stealing things. He explored how much of me he could convert into cash. That night, I did not call Evan. I sat at my kitchen table and wrote a list. Not a list of punishments, a list of realities. Reality, my son had used my identity. Reality, my son had taken my wife's belongings. Reality, my son had hidden them in a unit under my name. Reality, my son had pawned and sold pieces of my life. Reality, my son had mocked the grief he was selling. Reality, my son would not stop if I approached him with emotion. The next morning, Evan called. I watched his name on my screen until the phone stopped ringing. Then he called again. Then he texted. Then he called again. His panic made sense. Northgate had cut the lock. If he had planned to clean the unit out before auction, that plan was now broken. If he had planned to keep the unit hidden forever, that plan was now broken too. He needed to know what I knew. I didn't give him the satisfaction of hearing my voice immediately. I met with an attorney first. Her name was Sylvia Mercer. Diane had recommended her months earlier when I began noticing strange patterns in Evan's money requests. Sylvia specialized in elder financial exploitation and family fraud, 2 phrases I never thought would attach themselves to my life. Sylvia looked at the contract, the pawn receipts, the photographs. She didn't gasp. She didn't scold. She didn't offer hollow comfort. She offered a plan. The plan had 3 parts. Part 1, secure assets and documentation. Part 2, create boundaries that were legal, not emotional. Part 3, decide what outcome I wanted, because outcomes guide strategy. Sylvia asked me what I wanted. I wanted my wife's things back. I wanted my life back. I wanted safety. I wanted Evan to stop. I did not want a screaming confrontation that ended with me forgiving him again because the shame was too painful to hold. Sylvia told me to avoid direct confrontation until we had recovered what could be recovered. She told me to get the storage unit contents out immediately, with documented chain of custody. She told me to inventory everything and keep copies. She told me to let law enforcement handle the fraud side while she handled the civil boundaries. She also told me something that cut deeper than any legal statement. She told me Evan had turned my grief into a resource. People who do that don't change quickly. They change when the resource is removed. I returned to Northgate that afternoon with Sylvia's letter of representation and the police case number. The manager unlocked access for me. A staff member observed as I packed the unit, documenting items. I rented a truck and moved Laura's cedar chest and quilts back to my house. My hands were steady, but my heart felt bruised. Each box I carried felt like a piece of Laura I had failed to protect. Back home, I went down to the basement and opened every tote I owned. I checked what should have been there. I checked what was missing. I checked the corners and shelves like a man counting inventory after a theft, because that is what I was doing, counting the holes in my life. I discovered more absence. Laura's charm bracelet, gone. A small box of letters from my mother, missing. My high school yearbooks, gone. A toolbox that had belonged to my grandfather, missing. Each missing item was a new bruise. I realized Evan hadn't stolen once. He had been harvesting. When I got home from Northgate the second day, the cedar chest sat in my living room like a recovered body. I sat in front of it like a man keeping vigil. I opened it again and took out one of Laura's letters. It was addressed to Evan, written when he was 18, before life hardened him into the man who could tape pawn receipts to a filing cabinet. The letter described pride, hope, belief in him. I put it back without reading more. It felt too intimate to read without her permission, and she wasn't here to give it. That evening, I replaced every lock on my house. I installed a second camera. I secured my basement door. I felt ridiculous and old and ashamed, as if I had let the world turn me into a paranoid man. Then I remembered the unit. This was not paranoia. This was adaptation. Sylvia advised me to attempt recovery of critical items before they disappeared further. Some pawn receipts were within redemption windows. That meant time mattered. I spent a day driving to pawn shops with a folder of receipts, identification, and a police case number. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I presented documents and asked about redemption status. Some items were gone already, sold, moved, untraceable. Some were still in store safes, waiting for redemption deadlines to pass. I recovered my father's watch that way. It cost me more than Evan received for it, because pawn shops are not charities and loss is expensive. I paid anyway, because certain objects are worth more than the math. I did not recover Laura's wedding ring that day. The receipt for the ring listed an item description and a pawn shop name. When I arrived, the clerk checked the system and told me it had been transferred to another location after the redemption window passed. That was how pawn shops protect profit. They rotate inventory. They clear shelf space. I drove home with my hands tight on the steering wheel and felt grief sit beside me like a passenger. That ring was not just jewelry. It was the symbol of vows spoken in a church with a leaking roof because we couldn't afford a better venue. It was the ring I had held in my palm the night Laura died, when I sat on the edge of our bed in the dark and promised I would take care of our family. I failed to protect the thing that represented that promise. Then, a week later, an email arrived from an auction site Sylvia monitored for recovered items. Someone had listed a women's gold ring, vintage estate find, with a photograph. The ring in the photo had Laura's small scratch on the inside band, the scratch she got when she used the ring hand to open a stuck jar lid years ago. I recognized that scratch, like I recognized her handwriting. The listing didn't include my son's name, but the seller's shipping zip code matched Evan's neighborhood. I sent the listing to Sylvia. She contacted law enforcement through the case. The listing was frozen as evidence. The ring did not vanish into the mail system. I recovered it 2 weeks later, after procedures and signatures and a chain of custody handoff in a sterile office where grief had no language. When the ring was placed into my palm, I didn't cry. I felt something quieter. I felt the end of one lie. I had believed I could keep my family together by giving enough. The ring told me that giving enough was never the goal for Evan. The goal was to keep taking. Evan showed up 2 days after the pawn shop trips began. I saw him on the camera feed, standing on my porch with a posture that tried to look casual and failed. He raised his hand to knock, then hesitated, like he was deciding whether to perform remorse or anger. I didn't open the door. I watched. He knocked, then checked his phone. He looked at the lock, then at the camera, then back at the lock. He realized his access was gone. He stayed on my porch for a long time, long enough for the neighbors to notice. He made gestures with his hands, as if shaping explanations. He did not leave. I didn't open the door. I called the non-emergency police line and reported a trespasser. I used the language Sylvia advised. Unauthorized presence, prior fraud report, request for documentation. Not a family argument, a boundary violation. A patrol car arrived. Evan left before the officer reached the porch, slipping into his car like someone who didn't want to be seen in the wrong. After that, he switched tactics. He recruited my mother. My mother called in tears, describing Evan as desperate and misunderstood. She described him as grieving. She described him as a good boy who made mistakes. She framed me as harsh and unforgiving, as if forgiveness was a lever that would reset everything. I listened without arguing. Then I did what Sylvia said was sometimes necessary. I showed her evidence. I brought her to my house and opened the cedar chest. I showed her the empty jewelry boxes. I showed her the pawn receipts. I showed her the storage contract with my forged signature. I showed her the printed listing where Evan joked about selling old people's nostalgia. My mother's face changed slowly, like a curtain falling in increments. Denial is a careful thing. It doesn't collapse all at once. It loosens thread by thread. She cried. She asked why. I didn't have a satisfying answer. I had only the truth that a grown man who chooses theft over humility has already crossed a line that love cannot erase. Evan's next move was public. He posted on social media about an ungrateful father, about generational cruelty, about being cut off, about a man who valued old things more than his living son. He wrote in a way that gathered sympathy easily because it spoke the language of victimhood, and people love stories where a victim is pure and the villain is old and cold. It would have devastated me once. Now it felt like proof. The story he told didn't include the storage unit. It didn't include the forged contract. It didn't include the pawn receipts. It didn't include the printed evidence of mocking. It was a performance. I didn't perform back. I forwarded the post to Sylvia and let her handle it as evidence of harassment and narrative manipulation, which is a real thing in court when money and fraud are involved. That surprised me. It shouldn't have. The legal world has seen family lies turn into financial crimes enough times to name the pattern. The hardest part remained the grandchildren. Evan has a daughter, Sophie, 8 years old. Her mother, Marissa, had left Evan years earlier, but she allowed me to see Sophie because she knew I was steady. She knew I didn't disappear. She knew I loved without transaction. Evan knew that too. He tried to use Sophie as leverage. He began to suggest that Sophie missed me, that Sophie was confused, that Sophie was asking why her grandfather was cruel. He sent photos designed to pull guilt from my chest like a hook. For a day, it worked. I sat with one photo on my phone and felt my resolve wobble. The image showed Sophie at a kitchen table with homework spread out, her face serious in a way that made her look older than 8. My instinct was to fix it. My instinct was to transfer money, to remove stress, to buy peace. Then I remembered the storage bin labeled Mom. The label wasn't sentimental. It was organizational. I stopped my instinct before it became a mistake. I met Marissa at a coffee shop and told her the facts. I didn't trash Evan. I didn't ask her to choose sides. I showed her the evidence. I told her I wanted to support Sophie without feeding Evan's systems. Marissa listened and nodded with an exhausted expression that looked like recognition. She told me she wasn't surprised. She told me Evan had always needed someone else's stability to build his own life on. She told me she had stopped being that stability. We created a plan. If Sophie needed something, I could pay directly. School supplies, dentist visits, a music lesson fee, a winter coat. Marissa could send receipts, and I could pay providers. No cash, no transfers, no funnel back to Evan. It was the first clean relationship plan I had built in years. Meanwhile, Sylvia and the police pursued the storage unit fraud. The facility provided camera logs showing Evan entering the unit repeatedly. They pulled footage. They confirmed dates. They confirmed the email. They confirmed the phone number. They confirmed payment methods that linked back to a debit card in Evan's name. The truth gathered weight. In February, Evan's apartment was searched for stolen property tied to the case. The police recovered a few items, mostly things he hadn't had time to pawn or sell. A watch, a set of Laura's costume jewelry, a box of my old photos. Small pieces of a larger theft, but enough to show intent. Sylvia advised me not to pursue criminal punishment out of rage, but out of necessity. She asked again what outcome I wanted. I wanted Evan to stop. I wanted my things back. I wanted safety. To stop someone like Evan, you remove access and add consequences. Not because you enjoy consequences, but because some people interpret kindness as weakness. I signed statements. I provided evidence. I cooperated. In March, Evan was charged with identity fraud related to the storage unit and theft related to specific items documented in the receipts. The case moved slowly because courts move slowly and because family cases are messy. But it moved. During that time, Evan tried to negotiate through emotion. He sent long messages that alternated between remorse and anger. He implied he had been desperate. He implied he had been forced. He implied he had planned to repay. He implied I had made him into this by being too strict or too generous or not present enough. I saved every message and did not answer, because I had learned a lesson that felt cruel but true. If I answered, I would be giving him what he wanted most, an emotional lever. If I stayed silent, the only levers left were legal and practical. Evan's finances collapsed quickly after I stopped supporting him. He missed rent, his car insurance lapsed, collections calls began. He reached out to Diane and my mother and anyone who might pressure me into reopening the funnel. The pressure arrived in the form of concern, people asking if I was okay, people suggesting I forgive, people reminding me that blood is blood. Blood is blood, but fraud is fraud. I reminded myself of the cedar chest. In April, Sylvia helped me update my estate plan, not because I wanted revenge, but because I needed clarity. I moved my power of attorney away from family and toward a trusted professional. I created a small trust for Sophie that Evan could not access. I documented that any help to Evan in the future would be conditional and structured. I felt older signing those documents, not because of the legal language, but because I realized I was planning for a world where my son was a risk. That is a grief people don't talk about. It is a grief that sits beside you at dinner. By summer, the case reached a settlement stage. Evan's attorney approached Sylvia with a proposal: restitution for specific items and a diversion program for the fraud charge, contingent on compliance and repayment. Sylvia told me the decision was mine. I thought about Laura. Laura would have wanted Evan to become better, not simply punished. She believed in people more than I did. She saw potential in children who were loud and stubborn and lost. She would have looked at Evan and tried to find the boy inside him. I tried. I also thought about the storage bin labeled Mom. Potential doesn't erase harm. I agreed to the settlement with strict conditions: restitution, compliance, no contact unless mediated, and no access to my finances ever again. I required formal no trespass orders. I required that any contact be through Sylvia for a period. Evan accepted because he had run out of options. The truth is that consequences work even when they don't produce instant remorse. They force behavior change because the old behavior becomes too costly. In September, nearly a year after the first notice, I stood in my basement and looked at the boxes I had recovered. I had organized them properly this time, labels that meant love, not inventory. I had placed the cedar chest in a corner where it would stay dry and safe. I had installed shelves. I had made a space that treated my memories with respect. I opened one of the recovered photo albums and found a picture of Laura holding Evan when he was a baby. Her smile was tired and joyful. His face was round and soft. The future in that photo looked innocent. I stared at it until my eyes burned. Then I closed the album and placed it back on the shelf. I cannot rewrite the past. I can only protect the present. I still see Sophie. I see her through Marissa, through clean boundaries that keep love from being used as currency. Sophie doesn't know the details. She doesn't need to. She knows that her grandfather shows up, that he pays for her soccer league directly, that he brings her books, that he listens. Sometimes she asks why her father isn't around much. I give her a simple truth. Adults make choices, and the best adults learn from them. That is as close as I let the story come to her childhood. Evan has been quiet. The diversion program requires it. The restitution payments require it. The no-contact orders reinforce it. I don't mistake quiet for transformation. I take quiet as relief. The night I received the Northgate notice, I thought the sadness would come from losing something stored in a hidden unit. The real sadness came from realizing my son had built that unit as a hiding place for the parts of my life he could sell. He didn't just steal objects. He stole the illusion that my family treated my grief as sacred. He treated it like inventory. The empty shelves in those bins taught me something I should have learned earlier. Love without respect becomes a warehouse, a place where others store their needs and take what they want when you aren't watching. I stopped being a warehouse. I became a man again. I still carry sadness, but it is no longer the sadness of confusion. It is the sadness of clarity. Clarity is painful, but it is clean. The storage unit secret is no longer a secret. It is a line in my life where the story changed direction. Before it, I was a father trying to buy peace. After it, I became a father who refused to sell his dignity